They had no idea that the black woman they just banned from the theater was actually the millionaire CEO who owned the entire building, Dr. Ayanna Brooks was humiliated, escorted out by security, and told, "People like you don't belong here," by staff who didn't realize she funded their paychecks with her own money. But when she returned hours later and revealed her true identity, the shock on their faces was nothing compared to the swift justice that followed. Careers ended in minutes, lives were transformed on the spot, and what started as one woman's fight against discrimination became a viral movement that changed an entire industry. This is the incredible true story of how being underestimated became the most expensive mistake these people ever made, and why millions of people around the world are calling Dr. Ayanna Brooks a hero. You won't believe what happens when she finally says the words that destroyed everything they thought they knew about power. They had no idea that the woman they were about to humiliate owned the very ground they stood on. Dr. Ayanna Brooks adjusted her simple black hoodie as she stepped out of her modest Honda Civic, deliberately choosing to park 3 blocks away from the gleaming lights of the Meridian Theater in Manhattan's prestigious arts district. Tonight, she wasn't arriving as the CEO of Visionary Stage, the multi-million-dollar company that had just pumped $2.5 million into funding this theater's newest production. Tonight, she was just another face in the crowd, armed with nothing but her keen intelligence and a growing suspicion that something was deeply wrong behind these golden curtains. The irony wasn't lost on her. At 38, Dr. Ayanna Brooks had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into a media powerhouse that now funded diverse talent across 12 major cities. Her company's mission was simple yet revolutionary: to ensure that every stage, every screen, and every spotlight had room for voices that had been silenced for too long. She'd personally handpicked this theater for their latest investment because of its reputation for excellence and its promise to showcase emerging artists from underrepresented communities. But in the past 3 weeks, disturbing reports had been filtering back to her office. Anonymous tips from concerned staff members painted a picture that made her blood run cold. Stories of minority performers being relegated to inferior dressing rooms, of talented Black and Latino crew members being passed over for promotions, of subtle but persistent discrimination that seemed to permeate every level of the production. The most damning report came from a whistleblower who claimed that several staff members had been heard making explicitly racist comments about the very artists her foundation was supporting. As someone who had clawed her way to the top of an industry that had tried to keep her out at every turn, Ayanna knew these patterns all too well. Standing now in the crisp October evening air, she pulled her baseball cap lower over her eyes and slipped on a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that completely transformed her appearance. Gone was the polished executive who graced magazine covers and commanded boardrooms. In her place stood what appeared to be a graduate student or perhaps a struggling artist trying to catch a break. Her designer jeans had been replaced with worn Levis, her signature heels swapped for scuffed sneakers, and her usually immaculate hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail. The transformation was so complete that even her own assistant had done a double-take when she'd tested the disguise earlier that week. This wasn't Ayanna's first undercover investigation. She'd learned long ago that the only way to truly understand what was happening in the organizations she funded was to see them when they thought no one important was watching. Her unassuming appearance had revealed toxic cultures at 3 previous partnerships, leading to complete overhauls that had ultimately strengthened those organizations. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she was walking into a theater that bore her company's name on the program, funded by her vision, yet potentially betraying everything she stood for. As she approached the theater's employee entrance, Ayanna's smartwatch discreetly vibrated, confirming that both its recording function and her phone's backup system were active. She'd learned to document everything during these visits, not just for her own protection, but to ensure that any action she took would be based on irrefutable evidence. The security guard barely glanced up as she walked past, and for a moment, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, Just maybe, the reports had been exaggerated. But deep in her gut, she knew better. Her instincts had been honed by years of navigating boardrooms where she was often the only black face, the only woman, the only person who understood what it meant to fight for every opportunity. Those same instincts were now screaming that she was about to witness something that would test every ounce of her self-control and strategic thinking. The stage was set, literally and figuratively, for a confrontation that would change everything. If you believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what they look like or where they come from, then you're going to want to see what happens next. This story is about more than just one woman's fight for justice. It's about the power we all have to stand up when we see something wrong. Hit that like button if you're ready to see how Ayanna Brooks handles the discrimination she's about to face. Drop a comment telling me about a time you witnessed unfair treatment. And don't forget to subscribe because this 8-part series is going to show you exactly how one person can change an entire system. Part 2 drops tomorrow. And trust me, you won't want to miss the moment when everything starts to unravel. But the moment Dr. Ayanna Brooks stepped through that employee entrance, she knew her worst fears were about to become reality. The backstage area buzzed with pre-show energy as crew members rushed between lighting rigs and costume racks, their voices echoing off the high ceilings of what should have been a sanctuary for artistic expression. Instead, what she witnessed in those first 30 seconds would have made her sick to her stomach if she hadn't already steeled herself for the worst. "Excuse me, you can't be back here." The voice cut through the organized chaos like a blade, sharp and dismissive in a way that immediately set Ayanna's teeth on edge. She turned to face a tall, thin, white man in his 40s, his clipboard clutched against his chest like a shield of authority. His name tag read Marcus Webb, Floor Manager. And the way he looked her up and down made it crystal clear that he'd already decided she didn't belong in his world. Ayanna kept her voice steady and professional, exactly as she'd practiced. "I'm here to observe the production. I have permission to be backstage tonight." It wasn't technically a lie. As the CEO of the company funding this entire operation, she certainly had permission to be anywhere she wanted. But Marcus Webb's reaction told her everything she needed to know about how her company's money was really being spent. Permission. Marcus actually laughed, a sound so condescending that several nearby crew members turned to watch the exchange. "Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this area is not for people like you. This is a professional theater, not some community center where anyone can just wander around." The words hit exactly as intended, each syllable designed to make her feel small, unwelcome, and utterly out of place. What Marcus didn't know was that Ayanna had heard variations of this speech her entire career. She'd heard it in Harvard's computer science program where professors assumed she was there on charity. She'd heard it in Silicon Valley boardrooms where investors questioned whether she really understood the technical aspects of her own company. She'd heard it so many times that she'd developed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm while mentally cataloging every word for future reference. "I understand this is a professional environment," Ayanna replied, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. "That's exactly why I'm here. I'm interested in seeing how the production operates behind the scenes." She pulled out her phone, ostensibly to check the time, but actually to ensure her recording app was capturing every word of this exchange. Marcus's face flushed red with irritation. "Look, I don't have time for this nonsense. You're obviously some kind of intern, or maybe you're here to deliver something, but you cannot just walk around backstage like you own the place." He gestured toward the exit with his clipboard, his impatience growing by the second. "There are protocols here, standards that we maintain. This isn't the kind of show where we just let anyone behind the curtain." The casual cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. Here was a man who made his living in the arts, an industry supposedly built on creativity and inclusion, speaking to her like she was an unwelcome intruder in her own investment. But Ayanna had learned long ago that showing anger in moments like this only gave people like Marcus more ammunition to use against her. Instead, She simply nodded and said, "I see. And what exactly do you think my kind of show would look like?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for just a moment, Marcus seemed to realize he might be walking into dangerous territory. But his arrogance quickly overwhelmed whatever small voice of caution might have been whispering in his ear. "I think you know exactly what I mean," he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a confidential tone. "This production has investors, real money behind it. We can't have people wandering around who don't understand the level of professionalism required." That's when Marcus made his fatal mistake. He called security. What happened next would have broken a lesser person's spirit, but Dr. Ayanna Brooks had been forged in fires far hotter than anything Marcus Webb could ignite. The security guard who arrived was a heavy-set man in his 50s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than dealing with what his supervisor was calling a situation. But when Marcus pointed at Ayanna and said, "This woman is trespassing and refuses to leave," the guard's demeanor shifted instantly from reluctant to aggressive. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me," the guard said, his hand moving to the radio on his belt in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate. "You're being asked to leave the premises, and if you don't comply, we'll have to call the police." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Ayanna felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being criminalized for simply existing in a space where others didn't think she belonged. But as the guard moved to escort her out, Ayanna's trained eye caught something that made her blood run cold. Near the lighting booth, she watched a young black man in his 20s being berated by an older white technician. "I told you to coil those cables properly," the technician was shouting, his voice carrying across the backstage area. "Do I need to show you how to do basic work? This isn't rocket science." The young man's shoulders sagged with each word, and Ayanna could see the defeat in his posture that came from being constantly undermined and humiliated. At the same time, just 20 feet away, she observed a completely different scene unfolding. Two white interns, probably college students, were being patiently guided through the same cable management process by another crew member. "That's perfect," the supervisor was saying with genuine warmth. "You're really getting the hang of this. Let me show you the next step." The contrast was so stark, so undeniably discriminatory, that Ayanna's smartwatch vibrated as she discreetly activated its video recording function. "Let's go, lady," the security guard said, grabbing her arm with unnecessary force. "You've caused enough trouble already." As they walked toward the exit, Ayanna heard Marcus Webb's voice behind them, speaking to someone she couldn't see. "We've got to be careful about these people," he was saying, his voice low but not low enough. "They see a grant announcement and think they can just walk in here like they own the place. Next thing you know, they'll be demanding parts in the show." The casual racism in his words was stunning, but what came next was even worse. Another voice, belonging to someone Ayanna later learned was the assistant lighting director, responded with a laugh. "I know exactly what you mean. We've already got too many diversity hires backstage. Pretty soon we won't have any real professionals left." The comment was followed by more laughter, as if the systematic exclusion of talented people based on their race was somehow amusing. But the most heartbreaking moment came as they passed the dressing room area. Ayanna glimpsed a young Latina woman, probably an intern, standing alone while a group of white staff members chatted nearby. The woman held a clipboard and kept glancing toward the group, clearly wanting to ask a question or join the conversation, but every time she took a step forward, the group seemed to unconsciously close ranks, shutting her out without a single word being spoken. As the security guard pushed open the exit door, Ayanna heard the final insult that would seal everyone's fate. Marcus Webb, emboldened by what he saw as his victory, called out loud enough for half the backstage area to hear, "Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to sneak into places where you don't belong. We've got standards here, and we intend to keep them." The door slammed shut behind her, leaving Dr. Ayanna Brooks standing on the sidewalk with a phone full of recorded evidence and a heart full of righteous fury. They had just made the biggest mistake of their careers, and they didn't even know it yet. But Dr. Ayanna Brooks wasn't finished yet. Standing on that cold Manhattan sidewalk, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of walking away and letting her lawyers handle the situation from a distance, she was going to give these people one final chance to show their true colors. She pulled out her phone and made a call that would send shockwaves through the theater world, but not in the way anyone expected. "Hello, this is Dr. Brooks calling about the Meridian Theater production," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I'm calling to schedule a meeting with the director. I represent some potential investors who are very interested in the show. It wasn't technically a lie. She was indeed an investor, just not the kind they were expecting." The receptionist, clearly impressed by the professional tone and the mention of money, immediately transferred her to the director's assistant. Within 20 minutes, Dr. Ayanna Brooks was walking back through the front entrance of the theater, this time as a scheduled appointment. The irony was almost poetic. The same building that had ejected her through the back door was now welcoming her through the front, simply because she'd mentioned the magic word, investors. But this time, she wasn't just recording audio on her phone. Her smartwatch was capturing video, her phone was backing up everything to the cloud, and she'd even activated a secondary recording app that would automatically upload to her personal server. The director, a pretentious man in his 50s named Richard Whitmore, greeted her in the lobby with the kind of fake smile that theater people reserve for potential funding sources. "Miss Brooks, wonderful to meet you," he said, extending his hand while his eyes did a quick assessment of her casual attire. She could see the confusion in his expression. Her clothes didn't match his expectations of what a serious investor should look like, but the phone call had been too professional to dismiss entirely. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me," Ayanna replied, shaking his hand with just enough firmness to project confidence without seeming aggressive. "I've heard wonderful things about this production, and my clients are very interested in supporting innovative theater." She was walking a careful line, telling the truth while allowing him to make his own assumptions about who those clients might be. Richard's smile widened as dollar signs danced in his eyes. "Wonderful, wonderful. Let me give you the full tour, show you what we're building here. This is going to be a landmark production, the kind of show that really elevates the cultural conversation." As they walked through the theater, Ayanna noticed how differently she was being treated now. The same staff members who had ignored or dismissed her an hour earlier were now nodding respectfully and stepping aside to let her pass. But it was when they reached the director's office that Richard Whitmore made his first critical error. "I have to say, Miss Brooks, it's refreshing to meet with someone who clearly understands the caliber of work we're producing here. Too often, we get people who think they know theater but don't really appreciate the level of sophistication required for a venue like this." His words were carefully chosen, but the subtext was clear. She was different from those other people, the ones who didn't belong. "What kind of people are you referring to?" Ayanna asked, her voice neutral and curious. She was giving him rope, and he was about to hang himself with it. Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly feeling comfortable enough to speak freely. "Well, you know how it is with these diversity initiatives. Everyone wants to throw money at programs that sound good on paper, but they don't always consider whether the recipients really understand the standards we maintain here. We've had some challenges with that lately." His voice carried the dismissive tone of someone who considered himself enlightened while revealing his deep-seated prejudices. "Challenges?" Ayanna prompted, her phone discreetly recording every word. "Nothing we can't handle," Richard continued, completely oblivious to the trap he was walking into. "It's just that when you bring in people who aren't familiar with professional theater environments, they sometimes have unrealistic expectations. They think because there's grant money involved, they can just waltz in and demand equal treatment, equal opportunities. But theater is a meritocracy, Miss Brooks. We have to maintain standards." The words hit Ayanna like physical blows, each one confirming what she'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. Here was a man whose salary was being paid by her company, whose entire production was funded by her vision of inclusive arts, dismissing the very people her foundation was meant to support. But she forced herself to remain calm, to keep gathering evidence. "I see," she said carefully. "And how do you ensure those standards are maintained?" Richard's eyes lit up, as if he'd found a kindred spirit. "Well, for example, just tonight we had someone try to sneak backstage who clearly didn't belong there. Young black woman, probably trying to get photos for social media or something. We had to have security escort her out." He chuckled, as if the memory was amusing. "You should buy a ticket like everyone else," I told her, "if you can afford it. These people need to learn that access isn't automatic just because they feel entitled to it." The casual cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. He was literally describing his treatment of her to her face, completely unaware that he was confessing to discriminating against the very person funding his career. But Ayanna wasn't done collecting evidence. She needed to hear more. "That must be frustrating," she said, her voice sympathetic. "Do you find this happens often?" "More than you'd think," Richard replied, warming to his subject. "The assistant director and I were just discussing it earlier. He said something that really stuck with me. Don't let these people think they run things just because they got a grant. And he's absolutely right. We can't let political correctness undermine artistic excellence." There it was, the smoking gun that would end his career. Not only had he revealed his own prejudices, but he'd also implicated his assistant director in the systematic discrimination that was poisoning the very production her company was funding. Ayanna felt her smartwatch vibrate as it automatically uploaded the recording to her secure server, ensuring that this conversation would be preserved forever. "That's a very interesting perspective," Ayanna said, her voice still calm despite the rage building inside her. "I'm curious, though. What would you say if I told you that this entire production is being funded by a company specifically dedicated to supporting diverse voices in theater?" Richard's smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. "Well, of course we're grateful for all our funding sources. But at the end of the day, we have to answer to the audience, and the audience expects a certain level of professionalism. We can't let good intentions compromise the quality of the work." That was it. The final straw. Dr. Ayanna Brooks had heard enough. She'd given this man every opportunity to show basic human decency, and he'd failed spectacularly. Now it was time to reveal who she really was and watch his world crumble around him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice taking on a tone of authority that made him straighten in his chair, "I think there's something you need to know about the funding for this production." Right at that moment, the temperature in Richard Whitmore's office seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Doctor." Ayanna Brooks reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out a business card that would shatter everything this man thought he knew about power, privilege, and who really controlled his destiny. The small piece of cardstock felt heavy in her hand, weighted with the authority to destroy careers and transform lives. "Before we continue this conversation," Ayanna said, her voice shifting from the deferential tone she'd been using to something that commanded absolute attention, "I think you should know exactly who you're talking to." She placed the business card on his desk with deliberate precision, the same way a prosecutor might present evidence in a murder trial. "My name is Dr. Ayanna Brooks, and I am the founder and CEO of Visionary Stage, the company that is funding 100% of this production." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard Whitmore's face went through a series of transformations that would have been comical if the situation weren't so deadly serious. First came confusion, as his brain struggled to process what she'd just said. Then recognition, as the name and company finally registered. Finally, pure terror, as the full implications of what he'd just confessed crashed over him like a tsunami. "I'm sorry, what?" Richard stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands were shaking as he picked up the business card, and Ayanna watched with grim satisfaction as he read her credentials. Dr. Ayanna Brooks, CEO and founder. Visionary Stage Media Group. The same company name that appeared on every contract, every check, every piece of paperwork associated with this production. You heard me correctly, Ayanna continued, her voice steady as a surgeon's scalpel. I am the woman you just described as someone who doesn't belong here. I am the person your security guard physically escorted from the premises. I am the individual you suggested should buy a ticket if I could afford it. Each word was chosen with surgical precision, designed to cut through his shock and force him to confront the magnitude of his mistake. Richard's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. The color had completely drained from his face, and beads of sweat were forming on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the office. Dr. Brooks, I had no idea. If I had known who you were, I would never have... Would never have what? Ayanna interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Would never have revealed your true feelings about the people my foundation is meant to support? Would never have admitted that you consider diversity hiring to be a threat to your standards? Would never have laughed about having people like me escorted out of my own investment? The beauty of the moment was in its perfect justice. Richard Whitmore had been so comfortable in his prejudices, so confident in his assumptions about who belonged in his world, that he'd confessed his sins to the very person he was discriminating against. It was like watching a criminal accidentally confess to the judge while thinking he was talking to a fellow criminal. I think you misunderstood what I was saying. Richard tried desperately, his voice cracking with panic. I was speaking hypothetically about general challenges in the industry. I never meant to suggest that you personally... Stop. The single word from Ayanna carried such authority that Richard immediately fell silent. I have recordings of everything you've said tonight. I have video evidence of the discrimination I witnessed backstage. I have documentation of the systematic mistreatment of minority staff members that has been occurring under your leadership. She pulled out her phone and showed him the recording app, still running, still capturing every word of his pathetic attempts at damage control. Richard's eyes widened in horror as he realized the full scope of what she'd been doing. You recorded our conversation without my consent? That's illegal. Actually, in New York State, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation, and I certainly consented to recording my own conversation. Ayanna replied with the precision of someone who'd done her legal homework. But more importantly, Richard, you seem to be missing the bigger picture here. You've just admitted to discriminating against the very people my company was founded to support. You've confessed to creating a hostile work environment for minority employees. You've revealed that you consider diversity to be a threat to your standards rather than an enhancement of them. The office fell silent again, but this time the silence was pregnant with the weight of consequences. Richard's career was over, and they both knew it. But Ayanna wasn't finished. She had one more card to play, one more revelation that would drive home the complete scope of his failure. There's something else you should know, she continued, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone that somehow made her words even more terrifying. 15 minutes ago, I sent a message to my assistant requesting an emergency meeting with the full cast and crew. They should be gathering in the main theater right now, waiting to hear from the CEO of Visionary Stage about some important changes to the production. Richard's face went from pale to ghostly white. You can't be serious. You're going to fire me in front of everyone? I'm going to do something much more powerful than that, Ayanna replied, standing up and smoothing down her hoodie. I'm going to let them hear exactly what you think of them. I'm going to play the recordings of your conversations about diversity hires and people who don't belong here. I'm going to show them the video evidence of the discrimination I witnessed. And then, I'm going to let them watch as I transform this theater into something that actually reflects the values my company stands for. The walk from Richard's office to the main theater felt like a death march, but not for Dr. Ayanna Brooks. For her, it was a victory lap. Behind her, Richard Whitmore stumbled along like a man walking to his execution, which in a very real sense he was. His career in theater was about to end, and everyone in the building was about to witness it. As they entered the theater, Ayanna saw that her assistant had done exactly as instructed. The entire cast and crew were assembled on stage and in the front rows, their faces reflecting confusion and curiosity about this emergency meeting. She recognized the young black stagehand who'd been humiliated earlier, the Latina intern who'd been ignored and excluded, and dozens of other faces that represented the diverse talent her company was supposed to be supporting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ayanna began, her voice carrying clearly through the theater's excellent acoustics, "my name is Dr. Ayanna Brooks, and I believe it's time we had an honest conversation about what's been happening in this theater." What happened next would become the most talked about moment in theater history, a reckoning so swift and decisive that it would be studied in business schools for decades to come. Dr. Ayanna Brooks stood center stage, her modest hoodie and jeans a stark contrast to the ornate theater around her. But her presence commanded the room with an authority that made every person in that space lean forward in anticipation. "Some of you may be wondering why I've called this emergency meeting," Ayanna began, her voice carrying to every corner of the theater without a microphone. "Others may be curious about who I am, and what gives me the authority to gather you all here at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. Let me answer both questions at once." She paused, letting the tension build as nearly 100 pairs of eyes focused on her with laser intensity. "I am Dr. Ayanna Brooks, founder and CEO of Visionary Stage Media Group. My company has invested $2.5 million in this production, which means I don't just have the authority to be here tonight. I have the responsibility to ensure that every penny of that investment is being used to create an environment that reflects our values of inclusion, respect, and artistic excellence." The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps echoed through the theater as cast and crew members turned to look at each other in shock and recognition. The young black stagehand she'd seen being humiliated earlier sat up straighter, his eyes widening as he realized that the woman who'd been escorted out by security was actually the person funding his paycheck. The Latina intern covered her mouth with her hand, tears already forming in her eyes as she began to understand what this meant. But it was the reactions of the management team that truly told the story. Marcus Webb, the floor manager who'd had her thrown out, looked like he was about to vomit. His face had gone from pale to green, and he was gripping the armrest of his seat so tightly that his knuckles were white. Richard Whitmore stood frozen at the back of the theater, looking like a deer caught in headlights, unable to move forward or backward. "Now, I want you all to understand something," Ayanna continued, her voice taking on a tone that was both compassionate and steel-hard. "I didn't come here tonight to spy on you or to set anyone up for failure. I came here because I'd received troubling reports about the treatment of minority staff members and performers. I hoped those reports were exaggerated or misunderstood. Unfortunately, what I witnessed tonight confirmed my worst fears." She pulled out her phone and connected it to the theater's sound system with a wireless adapter her assistant had prepared. "I'm going to play some recordings for you now. These are conversations I had tonight with members of your leadership team, people who thought they were speaking to a potential investor rather than the woman they'd just had escorted from the premises." The first recording began to play, and Marcus Webb's voice filled the theater with crystal clarity. "This area is not for people like you. This is a professional theater, not some community center where anyone can just wander around." The collective intake of breath from the audience was audible, and Ayanna watched as faces throughout the theater registered shock, anger, and recognition. But it was when Richard Whitmore's voice began playing that the real devastation began. "These people need to learn that access isn't automatic just because they feel entitled to it. You should buy a ticket like everyone else, if you can afford it." The words hung in the air like poison gas, and Ayanna could see the impact on faces throughout the theater. This wasn't just discrimination. It was a complete dismissal of the very people the production was supposed to be supporting. The recording continued with Richard's confession about diversity hiring being a threat to standards, about not letting grant recipients think they run things, about maintaining professional standards by keeping certain people out. With each damning word, the theater grew quieter, the tension more palpable. By the time the recording ended, you could have heard a pin drop. "Marcus Webb," Ayanna said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Please stand up." Marcus remained frozen in his seat, unable or unwilling to move. "Mr. Webb," I said, "stand up." This time her voice carried such authority that he had no choice but to comply, rising on unsteady legs like a man facing a firing squad. "You are terminated, effective immediately," Ayanna announced, her words echoing through the theater with finality. "Security will escort you from the premises, and you will not be returning. Your behavior tonight was not just unprofessional, it was a direct violation of the values this production is supposed to represent." The theater erupted in a mix of gasps, murmurs, and what sounded suspiciously like applause from some of the younger cast members. But Ayanna wasn't finished. "Richard Whitmore, please join Mr. Webb on stage." Richard's walk to the stage was the longest walk of his life. Every step was witnessed by colleagues, performers, and staff members who had heard his recorded words, who now knew exactly what he thought of them. When he finally reached the stage, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "Mr. Whitmore, in addition to your termination, I want you to know that I will be personally ensuring that every major theater in the city knows about your conduct tonight. Your career in this industry is over." Her words were delivered without emotion, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You have 30 minutes to clear out your office before security escorts you from the building." But the most powerful moment came when Ayanna turned to address the assistant director who had made the comment about not letting grant recipients think they run things. "David Chen, you're also terminated. Your participation in creating a hostile work environment for minority employees is documented and unacceptable." The three men stood on stage like convicted criminals, their careers in ruins, their reputations destroyed by their own words. But Ayanna wasn't done delivering justice. She turned to the young black stagehand who had been humiliated earlier. "Jerome Williams, please stand up," she said, her voice now warm and encouraging. Jerome stood slowly, clearly unsure of what was happening. "I witnessed the way you were treated tonight, and I was impressed by your professionalism in the face of completely inappropriate behavior. If you're interested, I'd like to offer you the position of assistant stage manager, effective immediately." The transformation in Jerome's face was miraculous. From humiliation to hope in the span of seconds, his eyes filled with tears of gratitude as he nodded his acceptance. The theater erupted in genuine applause, and Ayanna felt her heart swell with the knowledge that at least one person's life had been changed for the better tonight. "Maria Santos," Ayanna continued, turning to the young Latina intern who had been ignored and excluded. "I saw how you were treated tonight, and I was impressed by your persistence despite the obstacles you faced. How would you like to be our new assistant director?" Maria's sob of joy was audible throughout the theater, and as the applause grew louder, Ayanna realized that this was what real justice looked like. Not just punishment for those who had done wrong, but elevation and opportunity for those who had been wronged. But the transformation Dr. Ayanna Brooks was about to unleash would go far beyond simply firing a few prejudiced managers. As the terminated staff members were escorted from the theater by security, their faces etched with the humiliation they had so carelessly inflicted on others, Ayanna turned back to face the cast and crew with an energy that seemed to electrify the entire space. What happened next would redefine what it meant to create an inclusive workplace in the 21st century. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ayanna announced, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there during the firings, "what you witnessed tonight was not just about holding individuals accountable for their actions. It was about recognizing that systemic change requires more than just removing bad actors. It requires building something better in their place." She gestured to Jerome and Maria, who were still standing on stage, their faces glowing with newfound hope and opportunity. "Jerome, Maria, I want you to know that your promotions come with full authority to implement changes that will ensure no one else ever experiences what you went through tonight. You're not just filling vacant positions, you're pioneers in a new model of leadership that this industry desperately needs. The applause that followed was thunderous. But Ayanna raised her hand for silence. She had more to announce. But individual promotions are just the beginning, she continued, pulling out a tablet that her assistant had prepared with detailed transformation plans. Starting tomorrow, this theater will become the beta test site for a revolutionary new system. I'm calling the Equity Assurance Protocol. Every interaction between staff members will be monitored by an AI system that can detect discriminatory language, biased treatment patterns, and exclusionary behaviors in real time. The murmur that ran through the theater was a mixture of excitement and curiosity. This wasn't just about punishing past wrongs. This was about preventing future ones with cutting-edge technology. Ayanna's tablet projected a holographic display that showed how the system would work, tracking communication patterns, measuring inclusivity metrics, and providing real-time feedback to managers about their treatment of diverse staff members. The system will be completely transparent, Ayanna explained, her voice taking on the enthusiasm of a tech entrepreneur unveiling a game-changing innovation. Every employee will have access to their inclusion metrics, and every manager will receive monthly reports on their progress in creating an equitable workplace. But here's the revolutionary part. Bonus structures, promotions, and performance reviews will all be tied to these inclusivity scores. The impact of this announcement was immediate and powerful. Ayanna watched as faces throughout the theater lit up with understanding and excitement. For the first time in their careers, many of these artists and technicians were hearing about a system that would actually reward fairness and penalize discrimination. It was like watching people realize they'd been given a voice in their own workplace destiny. "Maria," Ayanna said, turning to the newly promoted assistant director, "I want you to head up the implementation of this system. You'll be working directly with our tech team to ensure that the AI accurately reflects the experiences of people who have actually faced discrimination." Maria nodded eagerly, tears still streaming down her face as she grasped the magnitude of what she was being asked to do. But Ayanna wasn't finished revolutionizing the theater world. "Jerome, your new role as assistant stage manager comes with a special responsibility. I want you to create a mentorship program that pairs experienced staff members with newcomers from underrepresented communities. But here's the twist. The experienced staff members will be evaluated based on the success and advancement of their mentees." The genius of this approach was immediately apparent to everyone in the theater. By tying the career advancement of established staff members to the success of diverse newcomers, Ayanna was creating a system where inclusion wasn't just morally right, it was financially beneficial. Discrimination wouldn't just be wrong, it would be economically stupid. Now, I know some of you might be wondering about the production itself, Ayanna continued, her voice taking on a tone of creative excitement. Will these changes delay our opening? Will they compromise our artistic vision? The answer is exactly the opposite. Starting tomorrow, we're going to prove that inclusive environments don't just create better workplaces, they create better art. She gestured to the theater around them, its ornate architecture now seeming to glow with new possibility. This production is going to become a showcase for what happens when every voice is heard, when every perspective is valued, when every person is given the opportunity to contribute their best work. We're not just changing how we treat each other, we're changing what we create together. The energy in the theater was now electric, with cast and crew members turning to each other with expressions of excitement and possibility. But Ayanna had one more surprise that would cement this transformation in the public consciousness forever. "Finally," she announced, pulling out her phone and opening a social media app, "I want everyone to know that we're going to document this entire transformation process. Every week, we'll release behind-the-scenes content showing how the Equity Assurance Protocol is working, how our new leadership is developing, and how our art is being enhanced by our commitment to inclusion." She held up her phone, showing a live stream that was already attracting thousands of viewers. Right now, people all over the world are watching this theater become a model for the future of workplace equity. Your stories, your experiences, your growth as artists and professionals are going to inspire similar changes in theaters, corporations, and organizations everywhere. The realization that they were part of something historically significant swept through the theater like a wave. These weren't just employees anymore. They were pioneers in a movement that would ripple out far beyond their own industry. Social media notifications were already buzzing on phones throughout the theater as the hashtag number equity assurance began trending. But most importantly, Ayanna said, her voice now soft but carrying to every corner of the theater, I want you to know that this stage truly is for everyone now. Every person in this theater, regardless of their background, their appearance, or their previous experience, has the power to contribute to something extraordinary. We're not just producing a show, we're producing a future where talent and dedication matter more than prejudice and assumptions. As the meeting concluded and staff members began to disperse, the transformation was already visible. People who had been isolated and excluded were now surrounded by colleagues eager to collaborate. The young black stagehand, who had been humiliated hours earlier, was now being consulted by lighting technicians about his ideas for the production. The Latina intern, who had been ignored, was now leading discussions about costume design with senior staff members. Dr. Ayanna Brooks stood in the center of it all, watching her vision come to life in real time. She had entered this theater as a woman who didn't belong, according to the people who ran it. She was leaving as the architect of a revolution that would change how the entire industry thought about inclusion, opportunity, and the power of giving everyone a voice. What nobody expected was how quickly Dr. Ayanna Brooks' story would explode across the globe, transforming from a single night of justice into a worldwide movement that would reshape entire industries. Within 6 hours of the live stream ending, the hashtag number CEO reclaim had become the #1 trending topic on every major social media platform, with over 50 million views and counting. The video clips were everywhere. The moment when Ayanna revealed her identity to Richard Whitmore became the most shared business video in social media history. Her calm delivery of, "I am Dr. Ayanna Brooks, the CEO of the company funding this entire production," was being quoted in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. But it was the footage of Jerome and Maria's promotions that truly captured hearts around the world, showing millions of viewers what real justice looked like in action. Major news networks picked up the story within hours. CEO fires discriminatory staff after going undercover dominated headlines across CNN, Fox News, and BBC. The Today Show booked Dr. Brooks for an exclusive interview that would air the following morning. Harvard Business School announced they were already developing a case study around her equity assurance protocol. But the most powerful impact was happening in workplaces everywhere. Corporate executives were frantically calling emergency meetings to review their own inclusion policies. Theater companies across the country were reaching out to Visionary Stage to license the AI monitoring system. Universities were inviting Dr. Brooks to speak about her revolutionary approach to workplace equity. The comments section told the real story. "I cried watching Jerome get promoted after being humiliated," wrote one viewer. "This is what accountability looks like," posted another. "Dr. Brooks just showed every CEO in America how to actually create change instead of just talking about it." 6 months later, the Meridian Theater had become the most successful venue in Manhattan, with sold-out shows and a waiting list of performers eager to work in an environment that truly valued their contributions. The Equity Assurance Protocol had been implemented in over 300 companies worldwide. Dr. Ayanna Brooks stood on the same stage where she delivered justice that transformative night, now addressing a packed audience of business leaders, activists, and changemakers from around the globe. "They thought they were banning a troublemaker from their theater," she said, her voice carrying the same authority that had commanded respect that historic evening. Instead, they unleashed a movement that proved one fundamental truth. When you give everyone a voice, everyone wins. The standing ovation lasted for 5 full minutes, but the real applause was happening in workplaces around the world, where Dr. Brooks's courage had inspired countless others to demand better, do better, and be better. 6 months later, Dr. Ayanna Brooks received a handwritten letter that would move her to tears. It was from Jerome, the young stagehand who had been humiliated that night, now the head stage manager of 3 theaters and mentor to dozens of aspiring artists. "You didn't just change my career," he wrote, "you showed me that my voice mattered in a world that had convinced me to stay silent." That letter sits framed in Dr. Brooks's office today, a reminder that real change isn't about revenge, it's about recognition. "I learned that night that discrimination thrives in darkness," she reflects. "But the moment you shine a light on it, expose it for what it really is, it crumbles. The people who tried to make me feel powerless accidentally gave me the greatest gift, proof of exactly what needed to be fixed." The Equity Assurance Protocol now operates in over 500 companies worldwide, preventing thousands of people from experiencing what Dr. Brooks endured that night. But perhaps the most powerful lesson isn't about technology or systems, it's about the courage to document injustice when you see it, to stay calm when others lose control, and to use your power to lift others up rather than tear them down. As Dr. Brooks often says, "They thought they were putting me in my place. Instead, they helped me create a place where everyone belongs." If this story inspired you to stand up for what's right, show your support by hitting that like button. Share your own experiences with workplace discrimination in the comments below. Your story might be the encouragement someone else needs to speak up. And don't forget to subscribe, because we're bringing you more incredible stories of ordinary people who refused to accept injustice and changed everything. Justice is contagious. Help us spread it.